Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending the seminar on air pollutant emissions and possible health effects associated with electronic air cleaners. This is a topic that has garnered a lot of attention over the last few years as the number and type of air cleaning devices on the market has expanded dramatically in response to public health concerns, such as exposure to wildfire smoke or the coronavirus. We had people register for the seminar from all over the world, including manufacturers and government agencies. Shout out to Australia, academic researchers and laboratory scientists, consumer groups and school districts, public health policymakers, and importantly, members of the public. So welcome, everyone. Next slide, please. Just a few housekeeping items. The white paper is available for download on the website for this project, which can be found at the web link on the slide, or by Googling CARB white paper air cleaners. The video of this meeting will also be posted there. Feel free to post questions in the chat, which will be open during the seminar. Please indicate who your question is directed to, if to someone specific. Please do not post information about your air cleaning product in the chat. My email is provided on the slide if you have follow-up questions or comments. Next slide. So just a brief background for this project. When the California legislature passed AB 2276 in 2006, the primary concern was limiting public health impacts from consumer exposure to ozone emitted from air cleaning devices. The legislative bill that empowered CARB to regulate air cleaning devices stated that air cleaners could not emit more than 50 ppb of ozone, which was a level cited by FDA for medical devices in the 1970s. 50 years of subsequent research has identified other air pollutants besides ozone that are of potential concern. To date, CARB has certified nearly 9,000 air cleaners. Over the years, the types of technologies used in air cleaners has diversified. These technologies involve emitting substances into the air to affect a change in indoor air quality. With the growing number of different air cleaning technologies and expanded use of air cleaners in residential, commercial, and public spaces in California, CARB has a growing interest in knowing whether the substances emitted by air cleaning devices could cause health effects in people who inhale or are otherwise exposed to them, including in vulnerable population subgroups like infants and children. Next slide. The researchers who are presenting the results of this deep dive into the literature on electronic air cleaning technologies are Chris Kappa, Teresa Pistaccini, and Debbie Bennett, who are all accomplished research scientists at UC Davis. So with this brief introduction, I now turn the seminar over to Teresa. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kai. Let me get oriented here. All right, move this. Okay, you see the slide deck all right? All good? Okay, great. Okay, thank you for having us today to present our work on the topic of air pollutant emissions and possible health effects associated with use of electronic air cleaners. As mentioned before, the white paper is published on the CARB website. Chris, Debbie, and I will all be speaking today. We also have our co-author, Francis or Bud Offerman, here for the Q&A as well. And I just wanted to take a moment to recognize the assistance of the CARB staff on this project, as well as our graphics artist, Paul Fortunato, and several technical experts outside of UC Davis that reviewed our white paper and provided feedback. So the goal of an electronic air cleaner is to remove one or more contaminants from the indoor air. However, the air cleaner may also emit reactive compounds or promote the formation of chemical byproducts, which may have adverse health effects. Today, we're going to walk through and summarize our literature review findings on the topic. First, we're going to review electronic air cleaner types and operating principles. Next, we're going to discuss reactive compounds and byproducts that may be emitted or formed by electronic air cleaners, as well as human exposure pathways to these byproducts and potential adverse health effects. We will briefly describe test standards and regulations regarding these potential byproducts. And finally, we will summarize the gaps in understanding the risks and recommendations for future research. There's one important limitation of our white paper. We specifically did not review the efficacy of electronic air cleaners for contaminant removal or inactivation of biological contaminants. This is an important limitation because in considering the use of an electronic air cleaner, you need to weigh the pros and cons, the downsides in terms of risks versus the potential benefits of contaminant removal. And so just to clarify, today we're only addressing the risk side of the equation. The varied nature of the indoor environment makes it difficult to predict the impact of an electronic air cleaner in a particular application. I've illustrated here the major variables that we expect will affect the concentration of a chemical or contaminant indoors in a typical building. First, the concentration of a contaminant will be impacted by the concentration of the contaminant outdoors, as well as the air exchange rate between the outdoors and the indoors. The air exchange rate is likewise affected by the rate of the mechanical ventilation in the building, any open windows, the tightness of the building envelope, and environmental conditions that drive air exchange, like temperature and wind. Additionally, a contaminant may be emitted by building contents and materials, and it may be lost to indoor surfaces or through indoor chemistry reactions. These processes are also impacted by environmental conditions. Finally, an electronic air cleaner will then interact with that indoor environment and then potentially change the indoor environment. The complexity makes it difficult to compare and synthesize the literature evaluating indoor air cleaners, since all of these variables generally vary from one study to another. And so we've done our best to summarize that for you today, but we just wanted to illustrate the challenge in characterizing electronic air cleaner performance and risks. So let's talk about the different electronic air cleaner types and operating principles. The first one I'm going to discuss is an ion generator. This technology can have a lot of different names in the marketplace. I've seen terms including unipolar and bipolar needlepoint ionization, corona discharge generator, or plasma generator. The basic operating principle is that ion generator uses a high voltage electrode and a ground plate to generate ions, which are charged gas molecules, to then collide with and impart charges on particles in the air. The charged particles may then be more easily removed by filters or by deposition onto room surfaces. The ionization energy, though, created by the high voltage electrode can also initiate chemical reactions indoors. One main concern is ozone production, and there has been a lot of research into electrode design to minimize ozone production. However, I just want to note that the performance of the air cleaner and that electrode can be altered by deposition of particles onto the electrode. The second type of air cleaner is an electrostatic precipitator. It has a working principle similar to an ion generator, the main difference being that the high voltage electrode is in the form of several wires, and there are a series of plates designed to collect particles downstream. So instead of allowing the particles into the indoor air, the goal is to collect them on these plates. The plates need to be cleaned periodically to remove particles. And similar to an ion generator, the concern is the ionization energy from the electrode potentially initiating chemical reactions in the indoor air. Next type of air cleaner that we reviewed is photocatalytic oxidation, which I've also seen called dry hydrogen peroxide technology. The goal of PCO is to break down volatile organic compounds in the air. Volatile organic compounds are essentially chains of hydrocarbons in various configurations. And the design of this is for a UV light to shine on a reactor, which is a photocatalyst. What it does is breaks down water in the air to form hydroxyl radicals, which then react with the VOC, and with the goal of breaking it down into components of carbon dioxide and water, which is also called mineralization. The challenge is that achieving a complete reaction, breaking that VOC down all the way from the hydrocarbon chain, all the way down to carbon dioxide and water is challenging. And so the question is whether that is done completely or whether there are partially decomposed VOCs at the end of the process. And the performance can also change with time as the UV lamp or the reactor ages. So these components have to be maintained. Additionally, the UV light itself can initiate photolysis reactions, which can produce ozone. Essentially, this UV light is the source of energy itself and can initiate indoor chemistry. Also going to cover today ultraviolet germicidal irradiation, which is also called UGVI. And the goal here is to use ultraviolet radiation in the 100 to 280 nanometer range to inactivate biological contaminants in the air. There are two types of approaches. One is like a completely enclosed device where the radiation does not interact with the occupants, but the air is drawn through a device. And the other type of approach is that we're seeing some of is to actually irradiate an occupied space. And so the concern is the safety of human exposure to those wavelengths of light and that intensity of light. And both of these things are impacted by the specific wavelength and the dose. Also, as I mentioned before, UV light can initiate photolysis reaction and ozone production, and ozone production is possible at wavelengths under 240 nanometers, and we see peak production at about 160 nanometers. Although the goal of UVGI as a category is all the same, there are several different lamp types used in UVGI approaches, and so I just wanted to point that out because this impacts both the wavelength of light that's emitted and the intensity and will also now impact the potential risks for byproduct production and human exposure. So there's several different lamp types that I illustrated here. There are two other types of electronic air cleaners I wanted to mention briefly. One product we've seen on the market is a hydrochloric acid generator, which claims to generate HOCl from an electrode submerged in water mixed with table salt. We don't talk about this too much today because we haven't been able to find any peer-reviewed literature evaluating that particular working mechanism. So that's all I can really say about that at the moment. Also want to point out another class of devices, nano-confined catalytic oxidation, or NCCO. This is very similar to PCO in the working principle of the goal of breaking down VOCs into carbon dioxide and water using a reactor. The difference being, one of the main differences being, is that this actually contains an ozone generator upstream to facilitate that reaction process. The challenge here again is getting that reaction to go to completion, and now with an ozone generator present by design, there's a additional potential risk of ozone emissions. And with that, I want to pass the baton to Chris, who is going to start discussing potential emissions from air cleaners and the associated health effects.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. So we're going to take a look here at some of the emissions that have been characterized and some of the health effects of those emissions. But I want to start by just noting that in surveying the literature, it has been challenging to establish a comprehensive determination of all the potential emissions from these different devices, because it, as Teresa said earlier, it really depends on what's in the room in the first place. So we're going to take a look at a few different aspects here of the emissions and health effects. So let's go to the next slide. First one is the one that I mentioned earlier, ozone, right? Ozone is well known as a pollutant. Absent indoor sources, the main source is transfer from outdoor air. And outdoors, the ozone levels are regulated by the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, 270 parts per billion for the 8-hour average. When you bring that air inside, some of that ozone is lost to surfaces. And so you tend to have about 20 to 70% of the outdoor concentration indoors when you have no indoor ozone source. So when you have high ozone outside, you'll probably also have high ozone inside, or at least relatively high. In terms of the health effects of ozone, again, these are well established: respiratory tract inflammation, coughing, throat irritation, all sorts of lung problems. And epidemiology studies show that when you increase ozone by 5 ppb, you increase the relative risk by 1.008, and you can think that continues to scale. So every 5 ppb increases your risk. And so the question is, what happens indoors with these different devices? So next slide. So one issue is just the generation of ozone in the first place. The other issue is in the context of byproduct formation, because ozone, besides reacting with our lungs, it's a reactive molecule that drives complex reactions in the air with volatile organic compounds. What is produced from those reactions really depends on what the VOCs are in the indoor air, which is going to vary by environment. But in general, the byproducts that are formed from these reactions, when ozone reacts with a VOC, what you tend to do is add oxygen to the molecules, tending to add ketone or aldehyde functional groups in the end, and two important byproducts of the process somewhere along that chain of reaction tend to be formaldehyde and acetaldehyde overall. And so these ozone reaction products, like ozone itself, can be building related symptoms when you have higher outdoor ozone levels, for example, perhaps because of driving more indoor air chemistry in the end. So when we think about air cleaners, right, what happens basically is you take an oxygen atom, or not oxygen atom, an oxygen molecule, and if you pump in enough energy, whether that's a photon or through electrostatics, ion generators, right, you can split that O2 apart, giving you an oxygen atom. That oxygen atom can react with other oxygen molecules to make ozone inside. How much you make is going to depend on the details of any given device and the age of that device. ARB currently does require electronic air cleaners to be tested for ozone safety, and the test standard requires that you get less than a 50 ppb increase in a test chamber over a particular period of time with a particular ventilation rate. And this corresponds to an equivalent emission rate of about 4 milligrams per hour. In general, when these tests are done, the devices are tested when new, and as Teresa mentioned earlier, sometimes you can get degradation of things like electrodes over time that can change their performance, but that is undercharacterized in the literature in general. Next slide. And so UL 867 will prevent the highest ozone generating air cleaners from being sold, but you can still have generators that are just below that threshold that are generating ozone emissions indoors that can meaningfully increase the concentrations of ozone indoors, especially because those increases are coming on top of whatever the background concentration is in the first place. And so if you have somewhat higher outdoor ozone, or if you don't have major loss of outdoor ozone as it moves inside, you're adding to what might already be a high background and increasing the risk there. And one thing to note is just that the ARB regulation does include induct air cleaners as of October 2020, in addition to in-room air cleaners. And so on the right here, you can see some of the results looking at different induct air cleaners and in-room air purifiers. of various types here, reported by Guo et al. And we see in general the in-room purifiers produce less ozone than the induct air cleaners, at least when this study was done, but the new regulation will start to shift that as well. Next. Besides ozone, so ozone can react with some molecules, some other VOCs in the atmosphere, but it doesn't react with everything. But when we're thinking about these electronic air cleaners, we need to think about some of the other reactive oxygen species that might be produced. Most notable among those are hydroxyl radicals, so the OH radical. OH radicals are highly reactive, and they can react with almost any VOC, pretty much every VOC. And one challenge with understanding their production is that they actually do have a very short lifetime in the atmosphere, and that is because they are so reactive. And so they become very difficult to measure. You have to have very specialized equipment to actually measure the concentration of hydroxyl radicals directly, and their concentration is going to decrease rapidly away from any active generation source. However, studies that have worked to estimate concentrations or measure concentrations indoors find that they are generally comparable to outdoor concentrations, although that's going to depend on the light sources and other conditions that you have going on inside. And I should say, compared to outdoor concentrations during daytime, at night, you don't have much OH outside at all. Oops, Teresa? Yeah. So then one of the other things that we want to consider are the hydrogen peroxide concentrations. Hydrogen peroxide potentially as something that is generated directly from these or intentionally introduced. The concentrations of hydrogen peroxide are not reported in many studies that we were able to identify. Some do note there is some production from an ion generator. For example, this Zheng et al. Study found some production, but this is just for comparison, much lower than the concentrations that are observed when people clean with hydrogen peroxide inside, for example. So people sometimes use hydrogen peroxide actively inside. Hydrogen peroxide is also reactive. It can fall apart or degrade into hydroxyl radicals that can continue to react with VOCs and drive further byproduct formation. And those byproducts, like with what are EAC studies, I'm seeing a question, electronic air cleaners. When you have hydrogen peroxide or hydroxyl radicals reacting with VOCs, again, that's going to transform them to generally more oxygenated forms and produce things like, again, formaldehyde and acetaldehyde, as well as potentially many, many other intermediate species. Again. Yeah. Next slide.
And I'm going to take over for a little while. So as Chris mentioned, one of the compounds that's typically formed from the reaction of various VOCs and ozone is formaldehyde. And formaldehyde is a compound that we definitely worry about the health impacts from. It's both considered a carcinogen and also a respiratory irritant. California's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment has set limits for it. If you're not familiar with the different types of limits, there's generally one limit set to account for non-carcinogen health impacts. And so on the first line here, we see the safe chronic exposure limit of 7.3 ppb for non-carcinogen health effects. And for carcinogens, as a reference, we put up the air concentration that would result in a 1 in a million cancer risk for exposure over the lifetime, and that is 0.14 ppb. Likewise, the EPA also presents data on both the non-carcinogen and the carcinogen health effects. Their IRIS system, the integrated risk system, where EPA shares all of their research summaries, did a recent systematic review, and there's the current draft toxicological review from April 2022, and the reference concentration for non-cancer health endpoints is 5.7 based on more or less the impact that formaldehyde has on asthma exacerbation, and based on human occupational studies for nasopharyngeal cancers, the 1 in a million cancer risk is 0.13 ppb. So as you can see, these levels are really relatively low. Formaldehyde has been a compound of concern in the indoor environment for a number of years. Looking at homes built in California between 2002 and 2005, and this was after much had been done to try and reduce formaldehyde levels, the average concentration was 35 ppb. Then considering newer homes built between 2011 and 2017, the average is 19.8 ppb. And as you can see by comparing these levels to both the California and the EPA levels, they're already higher than the levels of concern. And so then if we know that formaldehyde is additionally coming from electronic air cleaners, that's only going to increase the concentration to where we're already in the realm of being above levels of concern. Next slide, please. And so just a little bit more detail now that we know why we're concerned about formaldehyde. This is definitely an intermediate product formed in the breakdown of VOCs, and in the outdoor environment, there tends to be higher levels of formaldehyde in areas where there's higher levels of VOCs. And formaldehyde production, when looking at the electronic air cleaner studies that were done to look to see what compounds were increased, formaldehyde production was generally observed. So that was both commonly measured in the various white papers or various studies that were included and generally found. And so there were 10 studies that were included in our white paper that measured formaldehyde production. In terms of that concept Chris was bringing out about it really depends on what's in the room, there's an example here on the right looking at an aromatic compound, toluene, and also limonene. So limonene, toluene is an organic solvent, which is common in a lot of things in the indoor environment and outdoors. So we do have that in the indoor environment, and that does not convert all that easily to formaldehyde. But limonene, which is a compound associated with lemon scent, basically. It's a non-aromatic VOC, and based on its structure, it results in much greater conversion to formaldehyde. And because it's associated with lemon-scented products, it is in a number of cleaning products used in everyone's home. And so it is something that is commonly going to be found. And so one of the summaries from looking at the studies included in the white paper was that first, we know that there is more conversion of electronic air cleaners when there's more non-aromatic VOCs in the room, and that was borne out in those studies. And so basically, this is of concern because these compounds are commonly located in the indoor environment. Next slide. So the second most commonly formed aldehyde from electronic air cleaners is acetaldehyde, the most common being formaldehyde. And acetaldehyde is additionally a carcinogen and a respiratory irritant, just like formaldehyde was. In the studies where they measured both acetaldehyde and formaldehyde, which was done in 4 of the studies, the ratio of the acetaldehyde to the formaldehyde concentration ranged between 0.15 to 1.1. So in general, there was less acetaldehyde production than formaldehyde production, although in one case there was slightly more acetaldehyde production than formaldehyde production. This compound has also been evaluated by both the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment and the EPA integrated risk systems, just like formaldehyde. And here you see the chronic limit in California is 77 ppb. That again is for our non-cancer health effects, but that 1 in a million cancer risk level would be 0.20 ppb. And just reminding you what it was for formaldehyde, it was slightly lower at 0.13 ppb. And then the EPA level has a lower level for non-carcinogen health effects of 5 ppb and a similar one for cancer health effects. But again, it's lower for formaldehyde. And so the reason I pointed out the comparison to formaldehyde is because, again, we see that acetaldehyde is generally formed. There's less production of acetaldehyde than formaldehyde, and it's slightly less toxic. So while both acetaldehyde and formaldehyde are very important, it's considered to consider the impacts of both of them. If one had to choose, it seems like formaldehyde would be the one that's of a bit more concern. Next slide, please. So, it's hard to measure everything, but there were some additional things measured. So acetone was measured in the electronic air cleaner studies. It was observed in the parts per billion range, but the literature on when it becomes an eye and throat irritant, eye, nose, and throat irritant is around 250 to 1,000 ppm. So you can see that the observed levels are much, much lower than any levels where we would have adverse health effects. On the acetonitrile, this is a very potent carcinogen. It has a very steep cancer potency factor. And so the level of concern for a 1 in a million cancer level is very, very low. This was only observed in one air cleaner in one study. And so the study authors speculated that it was most likely an emission from the air cleaner material, so the heated plastic, rather than coming from the electronic air cleaner mechanism. So this is obviously concern for various consumer products that would have this this is a potential source from the material, but unlikely to be associated with the mechanism for cleaning the air. And so it's definitely something that needs to be an eye kept on, but not in terms of how the air is being cleaned. Okay, over here on the right, we've got some other compounds, propionidal acid. I'm not going to pronounce my chemicals, sorry. These were all observed in using non-target analysis, where they went back measuring the broad spectrum of what was in the room and identifying those compounds afterwards. And these are less studied chemicals. So unlike acetaldehyde and formaldehyde, we don't have the EPA and California levels, but we're able to find some individual toxicological studies, and the levels of concern in those toxicological studies were several orders of magnitude higher than the levels found in coming from the air cleaners in the non-target study. There could be other things that are measured, but this is what measurements were available to us on the VOC side. Next slide, please. One of the other big concerns is ultrafine particles. So ultrafine particles have long been suspected to actually have more adverse health impacts than PM 2.5. They are associated with pulmonary inflammation, decreased heart rate variability, increased blood pressure, cough, and worsened asthma. And they're also linked to diabetes and low birth weight. However, because these compounds are short-lived in the air, they're not, they can't readily be modeled over broad areas. I mean, and so most of the air pollution models that look at air pollution levels, for example, across the country, don't include ultrafine particles. Only a few models do. And so for this reason, they haven't really been studied in those large scale studies with the large databases like PM 2.5. And so they're just more difficult to study. But a recent systematic review definitely supports the idea that there are adverse health effects with ultrafine particles that are greater than PM 2.5. And so this is definitely of concern. And it makes sense. They go deeper into your lung and are more easily passed into the bloodstream. Next slide, please. Ultrafine particles are created on that same sort of pathway that created the formaldehyde. So when you have an ozone plus a terpene would be something like a limonene that we mentioned before, or other scented compounds. So like pinene for pine and so forth. You form ultrafine particles. And so terpenes are found at higher levels indoors because they are in scented products designed to be used indoors to improve the fragrance of your home. So things like candles, air fresheners, and cleaning products. And the yield rate is between 8 and 39% of terpenes to ultrafine particles on a mass basis. And so ultrafine particles, because of that increased concern about the health effects relative to regular particles, and also the high potential creation of ultrafine particles, particularly in conjunction with use of cleaning products at the same time as the air cleaner, really leads to this being a compound of concern. Next slide. Okay, now changing gears a little bit, because the hypochloric acid was mentioned as a potential way to clean the air. There is no data on concentrations of hypochloric acid from air cleaners. Hypochloric acid levels, when you clean with bleach, can reach ppb levels. It can react with surfaces to form toxic chlorine gas when used, in situations such as cleaning with bleach. All of the epidemiology literature is associated with health effects using chlorine bleach. And so there's a clear literature showing increased respiratory and asthma symptoms, eye irritations, and sore throats following cleaning with bleach, where one can speculate that the primary compound that they were exposed to was the hypochloric acid. So that's really all we can say on the health effects of that. We don't have any information on the concentrations, so we have no idea what the health risks of this type of electronic air cleaner might be. Next slide. One other factor that we looked into is that one of the things that the electronic air cleaners can do is create ions and charged particles. So either a gas, molecule, or a particle with an overall net electric charge. And so these have been shown to be elevated with the use of an electronic air cleaner. There was one study that specifically looked at negative ions in the air, and they looked at school children in China and found a reduced heart rate variability with exposure to higher levels of negative air ions. And in adults, lower heart rate variability is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And so, one can assume it's probably not ideal in the children as well. The other thing with the charged particles is there have been studies primarily trying to understand deposition in the lungs for depositing medicines and stuff like that, showing that charged particles are deposited more effectively than neutral particles in the lung. And so while we know that there is more deposition to the lung, nothing has really looked further to say how this impacts the respiratory system. So, we also have other sources of ionized particles in our lives, and this is probably an area where more research should be done on the health side. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Teresa.
Okay, thank you. So shifting gears a little bit, just want to talk about a little bit further about the use of UV lamps and the potential risks associated with direct UV exposure. So the one thing that is important to understand is that the human exposure risk changes as a function of wavelength of the UV light. So the maximum risk is around 270 nanometers and decreases, notice this is a log scale, decreases quite substantially as the wavelength goes down. And so one of the areas of the main area of research is happening around this 220 nanometer wavelength, where the strategy is to achieve some disinfection performance without causing harm to humans. But the main risk is cancer of the skin and eyes, sunburn and skin aging, and then cataracts and other eye diseases, essentially anything associated with that sort of top layer of exposure. This picture I'm showing you here on exposure limits was developed specifically for occupational health standards. So people in the workforce that interact with UV lamps in the course of their jobs. So occupational health standards do not consider the entire population, specifically children, and how children may be affected by exposure to UV. So this is really an area where there's a lot of research happening and more work is needed here. I do want to just point out that there are approaches for UV where the goal is to not have any human exposure to the UV. These can be like upper room UVGI approaches or having enclosed devices where the air is drawn through the device. And those approaches, when used correctly, should not have any human exposure to UV. The concern is what if a shield is missing or there's a reflection or something along those lines. So these approaches do have to be used appropriately to protect occupants in the space. Okay, shifting gears, we're going to talk briefly about existing test standards and regulations and ones that we're aware of that are under development. So first, today we've talked a lot about ozone. The current CARB certification process requires testing to UL 867 or similar, where the chamber concentration has to be under 50 parts per billion, which equates to an ozone production rate of approximately 4 milligrams per hour. There's some assumptions in that calculation, which we include in the appendix in the white paper. There's another UL standard readily available that requires that the ozone production be an order of magnitude lower, so no more than 5 parts per billion. So certification to that standard is a way to really limit ozone production, and so that's available today. There's also another AHRI standard I mentioned, but similar in principle to UL 867. In terms of the assessment of other chemicals and byproducts, there's a lot of testing that's been done in literature, but every approach and every test is custom, right? And what we really need is a standardized method to compare and potentially certify devices against. And so, because you can't develop a regulation without a standard. There's 2 standards out there that get into the area of chemical assessment. One is AHA-MAC4, and this looks at the removal rates of 5 gases. The limitation of this standard is it's not looking at byproduct formation at all. So it's looking at how fast the contaminant is being removed, but if it's being converted to other things, you would not see that reported here. The one that I find most intriguing is ASTM WK81750, which is in process at a working group. And this is very interesting because what it does is it challenges the air cleaner with a chemical mix that includes both ozone and VOCs, and that is at least representative of the indoor environment. And it measures both ozone, formaldehyde, and ultrafine particle production, which through our literature review, we demonstrated, we determined are basically the chemicals of greatest concern that we know about today. And so that this seems like a pretty good approach in order to characterize the byproduct production in a reasonable way. So that's under development. And finally, I also just mentioned a UV safety standard here that looks at the tests the irradiation from the device and categorizes the risk. Okay, and then back to Chris for the conclusions.
All right, thank you, Lisa and Debbie. I get to wrap everything up here. So some of our conclusions here, we're gonna highlight a few things. First is that the assessment that we did is looking at byproduct formation, but what we haven't been able to do here, and as far as we're aware, no one has done in at all, let alone in a comprehensive manner, is really a risk versus benefit assessment of these electronic air cleaners. Admittedly, this would be really challenging to do because the byproducts depend on what's in the room in the first place. And so there are a range of risks that can come out, but those have to be balanced against the potential benefits. Also, you have to weigh the risks of the original compounds that you have versus the risks of the things that you transform them into. And so it's a question of turning one thing into another as well. One of the other aspects that Teresa was just talking about is that there really are no safety regulations other than regarding ozone emission. That's for California right now. There are standards, as you mentioned, being developed, and so that's a positive development. But right now, nothing else exists with respect to byproduct formation. In the assessment of the literature, what we found, one overarching point that's been mentioned here before is that studies only see what they look for in the first place. A lot of the analytical techniques are fairly specific to specific molecules. The more general methods, the non-target methods, have identified hundreds of compounds as potential byproducts from some of these air cleaners. Again, depending on what the things in the room are to start with. But very commonly identified byproducts of clear concern that we're seeing in many studies are ozone itself, as even if it is below that the current standard, can still build up substantially, and some of these do produce ozone. Formaldehyde is identified in many studies, and ultrafine particles as well. So these are compounds of clear concern, but moreover, these are also good indicators of general byproduct formation. If you're seeing these, you probably have other byproducts that are being formed as well. So they're kind of an indicator of other things that are going on. But some of the major knowledge gaps that exist are that we identified have to do with the byproduct emission rates, which are going to depend on, again, the operation of the device, but also what's in the room in the first place. And so we might think of those as kind of transformation rates. The exposure levels that you get to indoors, that'll depend on the indoor environment, the reactivity of the byproducts, the surfaces, as well as ventilation rates. And so that's where standardization of methods to characterize these can help. But then also the health effects. When we have a few compounds like formaldehyde, we can tie these directly to understanding of potential health effects. But when you're starting to scale up to potentially hundreds of different byproducts that are being formed, it can be challenging to assess comprehensively all the health effects. Next slide. One thing that we think is that in terms of knowledge gap, right, the quantification of human exposure to the compounds of clear concern is an issue, and that comes down to in part where there's a need for test standards for measuring byproduct formation, and so it is very good that there are some methods, test standards that are in development now, and we need to really quantify these things as well in terms of their increases in indoor air concentrations for different challenge compounds. There's also all these other compounds that have potential concerns that haven't been investigated in the literature in any detail that we could find. That includes hypochlorous acid, some of the ions, and some of the ionized particles that might be produced with some of these. And looking at, again, kind of the lifetimes of especially things like ions in indoor environments as well. How far do they even make it from a device, and how will people get exposed to them? Also, the health effects for direct exposure to UV light for the general population. As Teresa mentioned, things can be, certain devices can be installed to limit exposure, but other ones can be installed where there's potential for exposure. And so understanding the potential health effects from direct exposure is important, especially as it relates to the wavelength that people choose. And then tying to what I said as conclusion as well, is really quantification of air cleaner benefits. So we did not assess the efficiency of any of these air cleaners relative to either in an absolute scale or relative to other methods. So we did not test them, or we did not assess them with respect to their ability to remove VOCs from the atmosphere, indoor atmosphere, for their ability to degrade potential biological organisms. All of that needs to be really quantified to enable comparison of benefit versus risk. And that needs to be done in realistic environments, in rooms of appropriate size to understand how that's going to work. Next slide. And so this leads us to a few recommendations. One is we suggest further reduction in ozone emissions as we started to investigate. We did notice ozone from many of these, and even again, if it's meeting the current standard, it can still build up to substantial levels. And so we recommend that end users consider devices that are compliant with the more stringent guideline, the UL 2998. It's about 10 times more stringent than the current standard, and regulators might consider imposing this stricter standard. And then in terms of research needs to help close some of these knowledge gaps, one thing that would be needed is as this ASTM method is developing, to test air cleaners according to this, right? And then to understand how those results might apply to different building models and room sizes, and understanding how this might depend on what typical concentrations of some of the important precursor VOCs are in different rooms, and use this to understand whether additional regulations might be necessary or not, right? All in the context of acceptable versus unacceptable risk versus the potential benefit of any of these devices. There's a need to evaluate emission rates of specific things like hydrogen peroxide or HOCl as well, and health effects of many of these compounds at relevant exposure levels where they're not known. And so some things are known, but many things are not known in terms of their potential health effects. And next, I think that's it. So thank you very much for your attention, and we're happy to take any questions that you have.
I want to just address one thing that came up in the chat here. There was an error in the the standard year for AHAM AC4. So that was 2022, not 2002, which makes sense. It's been very recent. And Wayne Morris provides some great information that while the standard does not evaluate byproducts, the committee is active today and is there's a call for experts and that they intend to address byproduct production in the next edition of the standard. So that's very, very helpful.
I see a question here about NOx production from electronic air cleaners, and in general, that is probably not a major concern. We're not heating air up hot enough to actively produce NOx.
I'd like to just ask Bud if there was a question in the chat about the timeline on ASTM, the ASTM standard, if there's any updates on that.
Well, we went through our first review. I had some comments, and but I think we're probably it's on the fast track. Dustin Popadick at NIST is I think is the guy riding the herd here on that. But I did want to just briefly say, if I could, Joe, that although this white paper didn't really address efficacy and removal of pathogens, obviously this was a big concern during the pandemic. And those test reports that come out and just say how much you removed in 60 minutes, like 99% in 60 minutes, they're very, very misleading. And thank you, AHAM, for the clean air delivery rate. It was originally developed by Ken Whitby back in 1984. And but AHAM that is the metric that all air cleaners need to use for efficacy. It gives the engineer the ability to take the lab chamber data, make a CADR, and then guess what? Then you can go see what it does in your real world environment. A lot of these air cleaners might claim like 90% in 60 minutes in a chamber. Just the natural removal without the device operating is 80%. So when you calculate the clean air delivery rate, it's rather small, like 30, 40 CFM. These then translate into like only a few percent reduction in real life environments. So the clean air delivery rate is what you want. And I just wanted to chime that in. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. We also had a question a little bit back from Tony, specifically on 254 nanometer product. At 254 nanometers, the concern for ozone is small. However, that is where we are now potentially the human exposure becomes a greater concern. But in terms of byproducts, I will point you to the paper. There's some, the 254 nanometer lamp is also used in PCO devices. So there is some information in the paper. If you just do a search on 254, you'll come up with some of the studies that specifically discuss that wavelength, if that's helpful.
Thanks, Teresa. I also saw there was a question from Ella Vioska about, are there any concerns about NOx production from EACs?
Chris answered that one briefly. He said
no.
No.
Oh, okay. I didn't hear it. Sorry. So yeah, if there are any other questions, you can raise your hand. I can unmute you if you want to ask a question verbally, or again, just put a question in the chat. Anyone?
And for your nighttime reading, you can print out our white paper and take it home with you.
It may keep you up. It's pretty exciting.
Well, I while we wait for these questions to come in, I want to throw out a little kudos to ASHRAE for their 241 standard. And all the people that worked on that, this is a standard which provides guidance on total removal rate, not just the ventilation, but kind of like standard 62 did for ventilation per person. And this is the effective air cleaning rate, includes rates of removal or inactivation by air cleaning device. So kudos to ASHRAE for that.
There is a question from Elenita about sort of just the terminology air cleaner. We're using electronic air cleaner to describe the devices specifically that I introduced here, but there are also mechanical particle removal and chemical removal type of air cleaners that we actually discussed a little bit in the paper just to be comprehensive, but we were sort of specifically not including that in the webinar today. There's a question for CARB here.
Yeah.
Is there a plan to reevaluate the ozone standard?
This is Pat Wong. I'm manager of the building indoor exposure section. Every once in a while we do look at amendments and so forth. We will look at what we currently have, any possibilities. This white paper was a very important part of that. And also does, with those recommendations, it does also give us any ideas for future studies, maybe even including byproducts. But yeah, that's part of the reason we had this paper, just to kind of elucidate the knowledge gaps and see the recommendations. But thanks for the question.
Okay, there's a couple other questions here. I may not go in order. So the Wes asked a question about why even use electronic air cleaners. Are mechanical filters and drawing air through a filter effective? And this is yeah. So this is difficult because again, really to do a full assessment, you'd have to compare benefit versus risk. But mechanical filters are well demonstrated for being effective at removing particles. That is a completely solid approach to particle removal in the indoor environment. And technologies like activated carbon are good ways to remove chemicals in the indoor environment. It's interesting having gone through this process and reading all these papers. I think there are some interesting working principles involved in electronic air cleaners, and so you can see why one would want to keep exploring these technologies. But in terms of what is essentially proven safe and effective with good performance today, a mechanical type approach with a fan and a filter is the least riskiest approach with the best demonstrated benefits.
I'll add that I think after assessing the literature here, the electronic air cleaners are going to largely be limited by the same factors that limit filtration and things like that anyway, and that is the movement of air through the device. So some of these talk about spreading out, OH radicals to a room, but that doesn't happen. I mean, very reactive things are very reactive, and they react in close proximity to the device. And so you don't spread these things out across the entire room. And so it's how much air you're moving through that device in the first place. And so even if they are effective, they're still going to be limited by those same principles of moving air through a device for the most part, with the exception of potentially the UV radiation, which can spread to an entire room. And so I think when we think about the potential use of them, then we need to think about exactly that question. How do they compare with these other well-established methods?
And following up on Todd, we weren't, the goal here wasn't to rank or recommend any products. We're essentially building awareness of how electronic air cleaners, like how these technologies, what their working principles are, and what potentially can happen by applying that working principle. It would be very difficult. It's even very difficult to compare directly one air cleaner to another, just because, as we talked about in the beginning, the the environment that all these studies are done in is not the same. And so then that really drives the need for a test standard that measures byproduct formation, because then with something like that, although it won't be perfect and it'll never be completely representative, that's a way to do apples to apples comparisons between products. Let's see. So
See, there was a question from Alec Terrazas about, is there a central location where future research might be posted or discussed in general regarding electronic air cleaners and what was discussed today?
well, let's see. CARB has, I mean, CARB, you have your website that I didn't post. I just posted the link to the white paper. Maybe you want to post your link to your section, like the main website for that.
Yeah, we can put a link for our air cleaners page.
Yeah, that would probably be a good idea.
Yeah, sure.
And then I'll also, in response to, there was a question about childcare centers. It's a little bit off topic for this. It's a little bit of a tangent for this topic, but I'm going to just post a link to a WCEC website on indoor air cleaning in schools.
And I'm happy to address Todd's comment disagreeing. Appreciate people disagreeing. I'm not saying that that byproducts would not be measured throughout a room. They absolutely would be. They are formed as they pass through a device and then they spread through a room. But the radicals themselves do not last very long. And so the byproducts will be spread through a room. That's certainly true. It's to see where the action is going on with the radicals. Going to be localized depending on how fast they react.
I just want to say to Chris, kudos on bringing up that it's a very high bar for what we call additive air cleaners, where you're adding stuff with the idea of trying to remove stuff. And not only the additive agents, but as you were saying, the reaction products. And then what you alluded to several times, I just want to underline it here, is that it's very difficult. And I'm a member of the ASTM working group, but it's going to be baby steps because there are so many potential precursor chemicals that can react with these additive devices and create bad things that it's very difficult to actually prove that your device, when it might encounter all kinds of common indoor VOCs, that we might end up creating some bad things. So that the electronic air cleaning industry, I think, has their work cut out for them to be able to actually prove that the devices are safe.
Good point.
Yeah, and I think with respect to radicals like OH, ions are going to behave similarly. They can react with VOCs directly, but more likely they're going to create other radicals that can react with VOCs in the end. But those are going to be fairly localized to the device, and then the products will spread from there.
I guess I'll ask a quick question. Did you guys find anything related to the removal of VOCs other than, say, like carbon, any sorbents that were particularly effective, or anything in the literature that suggests there's something new coming along that's really effective for VOCs and not going to transform them to something else?
We didn't look to that question. We weren't looking at effectiveness, but I will just say I'm unaware of anything in particular that's better than activated carbon for just removing stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, a huge challenge, right, is if you have nothing in the room to start with, just have nitrogen and oxygen, and you turn one of these on, then it's not removing anything because there's nothing there to start with. But the more stuff that you have in the room to begin with that you want to remove, the more you have to worry about byproduct formation. So a challenge with electronic air cleaners is that, you know, your potential for byproduct formation scales as your need for removal might increase. And so it's a challenging problem. And so if you can just remove them without creating byproducts, then great.
Pat, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, as mentioned earlier, yeah, great seminar and topic, by the way. Our certification involves obviously new air cleaners. Over time, what would you expect byproducts to be more? Would you expect the chance of ozone formation to get higher later on? There's not a lot of literature about what happens as the air cleaners age and with the use.
That's exactly right. There's not a lot of literature on how these things will change with use. The literature that does exist suggests that in general, as the electrodes degrade in any of these devices, there's a greater potential for formation of ozone, and therefore for other byproducts as well. But that has not been assessed in comprehensively at all.
Okay,
Or
thanks.
really been that systematically.
Thanks.
Okay, well, last call for questions. Anything else? Okay, I think turn it over to you for any final comments.
We've seen a hand. I think I see one hand. Masa, is your hand up?
I'm looking here.
Or maybe that's just my cursor. Never mind, that's my cursor.
Well, you're trying to cold call on people. Okay.
Oh, it's like, were you paying attention?
Okay.
Are
Well-
there any more questions?
There was one question someone asked, and they said, you know, well, what's the advantage of these additive air cleaners, electronic air cleaners over mechanical air cleaners? And I think at some point, electrostatic precipitators was a lower pressure drop. But generally speaking, I think it's more of a marketing thing. Your HEPA filters and everything are, you know, the patents have all expired on these things. And you can get them at, you know, portable air cleaners with HEPA filters at Amazon for about $1 a CFM of clean air. But then I think a lot of the products out there are putting things like UV light and PCO or ionizers on it, and for claims of higher performance. But that really needs to be demonstrated yet, right? So we'll wait to see. But I think it's that kind of a thing, though, that if you can put something different onto your HEPA filter, you can perhaps you know, claim, you know, you can claim a higher performance at. But I think that's the working group. I think will at ASTM will make some inroads into there.
Bonnie asked a question on the most important research direction to better characterize the concerns of byproducts. I mean, I wouldn't really call this research, but in terms of making an impact in the world, getting a agreed upon test standard from a respected agency that characterizes these byproducts that can then be used for testing and can be asked for by consumers, right? If they're going to consider buying a particular product, can you provide a test report to standard XYZ, right? Being able to get that data in a standardized and comparable format, I think is the most important thing for actually making an impact in the marketplace.
I agree, but step one on when you're looking at an additive air cleaner, you already have test methods that like AHAM, AC5, right, that do microbial inactivation removal rates. So if the CADR is insignificant, a very low CADR, you really don't need to go to the next question, right? Is it creating bad stuff? Because the cost benefit has already been settled. So I just wanted to mention that we don't have to wait too much for the CADR removal or inactivation of pathogens. We have test methods out there, and
Teresa makes a very important point here. One of the most common questions we receive almost every day is, can you tell me if my air cleaner is safe? And so we cannot make that claim for the reasons that were shown in this seminar. We do make, other statements, but it would be really great to be able to have some recognized test standard that was deemed safe, in terms of public health impact.
Or at least safe with respect to contaminants.
Exactly.
XYZ.
What's known.
Yeah.
I think that brings us to the end of our seminar. If there are any other burning questions, this is your chance. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again for being here, everyone. And you have my email, which was on the first slide, and Julia Gress at arb.ca.gov. If you have any follow-up questions, check out the white paper, download it. And
we can post the slides too. I could send them to you in PDF.
yes,
Okay.
We'll do that.
We have some notes in the footers. Let me take those out and get you a PDF copy, and we can post that.
Okay, sounds great. And thank you to all our colleagues at UC Davis. We really appreciate working with you.
Okay.
All right,
Thank you.
take care. Mhm.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.